Hello everyone, I am Masih Alinejad and this is The World According to Masih, the podcast where we explore global events through unfiltered conversations with bold thinkers and changemakers. Today, my guest is Bret Stephens, opinion columnist for the New York Times. But before Times, Bret was also a columnist at Wall Street Journal, where he won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013. Bret has strong views on US foreign policy, especially on matters related to Middle East.
I find it incredibly worrisome that there are these enormous places where we ought to be having vibrant and intelligent and good faith conversations that are now no-go zones. If you criticize any aspect of a culture that's not your own, it is impermissible. And that strikes me as an illiberal mentality.
They blocked me from everywhere. They ignored the women of Iran in the name of Islamophobia, or it's your culture. And you keep hearing that, it's their culture.
Ask yourself, well, are they stupid? And maybe sometimes the answer is a simple yes, they were stupid. And it's a good thing because the world is safer for their stupidity.
If it's gonna cost my life, but Iran is gonna be free, I'm ready. No, when I see you always, the first thing comes to my mind is my brother.
Your brother.
Because you were the one.
I wrote about him.
Yes, when my brother was in prison.
Yeah.
Like a hostage in the hand of regime. I felt useless, like helpless. Couldn't do anything because in the West, it's not that easy to get the attention of the media about political prisoners, about freedom fighters. So you work for New York Times as a columnist. New York Times is a platform for liberal. As a conservative, I think it's not that easy to deal with them. I'm going to get there about my challenge with New York Times, but I want to know how you feel this. And do you have like internal challenge with New York Times?
Look, the New York Times has always had an editorial page that leans to the liberal side of the political spectrum, but they've always had one or two conservative columnists. Mm-hmm. So for many years, that person was a man named Bill Sapphire, who has now been dead for many years, but he was sort of a landmark or marquee columnist. And I kind of feel like I stepped into his shoes. I think the paper has a healthy attitude that they should give someone from the opposing camp a kind of a strong and persistent voice at the paper. Mm-hmm. So that's the job that I fill. The great advantage is that the reach of the New York Times is incredible. I feel like everyone participates in the newspaper in a way that wasn't entirely true of my previous employers at the Wall Street Journal. And so, yes, I'm in a minority in my views, but sometimes when you're in a minority, people pay more attention to what you have to say.
I don't want to get you into trouble, but I really want to know that there is nothing like about New York Times and, you know, their views makes you angry, furious, or, you know, get yourself into trouble.
Well, I don't always agree with my colleagues on the opinion page, and that's fine. I mean, I grew up in a family where disagreement was normal. We argued all the time, and I never took it personally. And because no one is stopping me from saying what I want to say, I feel
Maybe
okay.
That's why. Because New York Times once actually called like Hassan Nasrallah kind of like a scholar. Washington Post called al-Baghdadi terrorist as a man of peace. Like some of the journalists working for New York Times and Washington Post in mainstream media in the West, when it comes to writing about Middle East, they call which I say, negotiator of death, and terrorists, they call them man of peace or negotiator of peace, diplomats. So that's why when we live under a regime that kills our people, you know, targeting the innocent family members of journalists like hostage and punishing the family members. So maybe we take it personal because a lot of people in the Middle East that I'm talking to them from Iran, Iraq, Syria, who have first experience of living under authoritarian regime, under terrorist regime, they really get offended by some of the Western media in the way they deal with terrorists. So that's why maybe you said a good thing that you didn't take it personal because they don't.
You have to separate two sides of the paper. There's my side, which is the opinion section, and then there's the news side with a different lines of authority. And I understand that the paper angers one constituency or another. And it's a vast enterprise with hundreds of stories every single day. Mistakes get made. People treat the New York Times as if it's the Holy Bible. And so if they see a word that they don't like, it's not seen as, I don't know, a reporter or an editor choosing the wrong word. It's seen as a statement of ideological intent. But on the whole, I think it's impossible to understand the world without reading the New York Times. Even people who dislike the paper or dislike some of its politics will, if they're honest with themselves, say, I couldn't really see what's happening in the world without reference to the Times. And when it comes to stories like Iran, I think the paper, as best as is possible given the nature of the regime in Iran, has done a remarkable job of shedding light on the repressive, more than repressive, the repressive and totalitarian nature of the regime in Iran and in other places as well. Some of these stories you're not going to find anywhere else, and they happen because there are a lot of courageous and persistent reporters at the Times who really get at the story.
So, overall, what is your take on what I mentioned, actually calling the terrorist regime not the way that they are? What is this hesitation about? Like when it comes to dictator of Libya, Gaddafi, I remember, I think New York Times was the same, calling dictator of Libya. But when it comes to calling the terrorist regime who they are, there's hesitation. I'm not talking just about New York Times, about mainstream media.
I am accountable for what I write.
Yeah, I know. That's why maybe you're not the right person that I challenge you.
Not what other people write. And what I write about Iran has been very consistent over many years.
You've done a great job. But I know that
a despotic and corrupt theocracy.
I know that. But I believe that you know the nature of the media in the West better than we do, people from the Middle East. And that's why I'm asking you this question, because I see that, like, for instance, Qasem Soleimani, I know you have shaped, for many years, for decades, you have actually wrote about Middle East and gave voice to not just people who are the victims of the Iranian regime or Middle East inside the country, but actually talking about transnational repression, how they target beyond their own borders. But at the same time, I really don't get that, because this is common sense. When it comes to challenging Qasem Soleimani, I see that New York Times, CNN, calling him national hero. So that's something that I don't get it. Like, people in the Middle East don't get it. So that's why I want to know how you analyze this, how you see this in the West.
Well, the way I see Qasem Soleimani was as the leader of a terrorist force within the IRGC, which is itself a terrorist organization. And I'm not sorry he's gone.
That's something I think is common sense, it's logic, and everyone should say that.
Yeah.
But for us, it was difficult. For us, people in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Iran, all the victims of Qasem Soleimani, as you said, we were celebrating his death. But Bret, it was not easy to get the attention of the media, saying that eliminating a terrorist is not tragedy, is a sign of victory for the victims who have suffered a lot.
Well, you're putting your finger on a point which I think is so important, which is the misery that the Islamic regime in Tehran has inflicted on so many Arabs, Kurds, Afghans, so many others around the region. People think that Iran's problem is with the Israelis, and of course that's absurd. When Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah, which I think was a great thing, the greatest victory was not for Israel, it was actually for the Lebanese people. And if one spends any amount of time in these countries as I have and really asks more than superficial questions, one begins to understand that what Hezbollah wasn't a liberation movement or a resistance movement. It was a repression movement and a subversion movement of the Lebanese nation, of the Lebanese people. That enormous explosion that nearly destroyed Beirut, what was it, about five years ago? It's difficult to imagine that would have happened if Hezbollah hadn't been in charge of the port. I mean, I think there's a reasonable suspicion that the reason all that material was there was it was being used as explosives by Hezbollah, if you will. And that's an underreported story. I don't think people in the West have a sufficient appreciation of the extent to which organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and other affiliates of the Islamic regime make a misery of the lives of poor, mostly Arab people in the countries they conquer under the false ideological pretense of quote unquote resistance to Israel. The best thing that could happen with the destruction of Hamas as a military force and as a political force in Gaza and the West Bank would be liberation for Palestinians from the tyranny under which they've been living, certainly in Gaza, for the last 17 years. And that, I think, is a real failure throughout the West, in too many newspapers, that the conflict is played as Iran versus Israel or the United States versus Iran. To me, the real conflict is between the moderates and the modernizers and the autocrats and the religious fanatics. That's the real axis of division. And what I hope has happened in the last month especially is that the axis of moderates and modernizers has grown much stronger.
That's why I want to now talk about my concern in the West, in America, in New York City, rise of radicals. It was heartbreaking for me to hear the chant of I am Hamas, I am Hamas, in university campus, colleges campus. It was difficult for people of Iran to hear that pro-Hamas students calling themselves activists, dissidents, covering their face and supporting those who have killed many of our beloved people in the Middle East. Yeah. But it's not just that rise of radicals. When you see that, as I mentioned, media calling those terrorists heroes, national heroes, or resistance movement. Now I see that Friday prayers in Times Square. And to me, it just reminds me of the time when our high school, our streets, parks became a place for religious, like fanatic religious people to pray. There are more than 300 mosques in New York.
Yeah.
What is about these fantasizing with the radicals saying that we want to pray in the streets? So let's just talk about Mamdani. I'm not sure whether he's going to get elected or not, but I want to talk about the rise of radicals.
I think people understand Mamdani incorrectly, which is that they see him as a voice of Islam. I don't see him that way. I know he's his father's, I guess both his parents are Muslim, but at least his mother is an Indian film director. But to me, Mamdani, I don't think really represents Islam. Mamdani represents the progressive left. And this bizarre marriage or fascination that the progressive left has with the theocratic Islamist right. I mean, the progressive left has no problem denouncing religious bigotry when it comes to, say, right-wing Christians. But the same bigotries which are expressed by Islamists, they're silent about. They don't want to talk about the violent homophobia in much of the Muslim world. They don't want to talk about the misogyny and the brutal repression of women. They make common cause with not the forces of reform in Islam, not the strains of Islam that are arguing for the divorce of politics from religion, but they're arguing for the ones that want the marriage of politics and religion. Of course, when they see the exact same phenomenon in other religions, they're opposed to them. And there's something psychologically mysterious about this. I mean, presumably, if you are a Western progressive who believes in, say, all gender bathrooms, in the greatest possible tolerance for every conceivable lifestyle, never mind sort of more 20th century freedoms like women's rights or, basic racial equality, then my question is, why are you making common cause with probably the single most repressive, backward, and violently bigoted mass movement there is in the world today, which is the movement of radical Islam? Where's the place of religious minorities in countries like Pakistan? If you're a religious minority in Pakistan, you're either in deep danger or you're seeking exile. Why is this not spoken about? Why is it that the movement for freedom in Iran, which to me was just the most extraordinary and courageous movement that any of us have witnessed in a long time, was treated with a kind of ambivalent disdain by the left? And how is it that someone like Mamdani cannot bring himself to condemn the phrase globalize the intifada, suddenly, as he puts it, insisting that he's a believer in free speech and doesn't want to police free speech? So let me ask him another question. Well, if you don't want to police the phrase globalize or condemn the phrase globalize the intifada because you believe in free speech, how about replacement theory? How about states' rights? How about any number of code phrases on the far right in American politics, which of course he would instantly denounce, have no trouble denouncing. So, I understand people like Mamdani. He grew up in very privileged circumstances. His father's a professor of Columbia. His mother is an acclaimed film director. And it's often the case that young men who grow up in great comfort adopt a kind of what we used to call radical chic politics, and make them their own. But if you're actually going to champion the rights of women everywhere, the rights of gay people anywhere, the rights of religious minorities anywhere, and at the same time fail to condemn chants of globalize the intifada, or make common cause with the most extreme aspects or the most extreme elements in modern day Islamism, you're guilty of a kind of some combination of stupidity and hypocrisy. I don't see it any other way.
Do you get any backlash by Islamists when you criticize Islamic ideology, or you go?
Yeah, sometimes it's very strange. Many years ago, I'll tell you that I try not to look at social media. It's better for my mental health. But every now and then I succumb or people send me things. So many years ago, this is maybe now 15 years ago, I wrote a column. It was almost whimsical, but the suggestion was, let's buy Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Let's say to the Pakistanis, we will give you modern American military equipment, and in exchange, we will buy your nuclear weapons and we'll forgive your debts. And that would be a good deal for Pakistan. So I've written thousands of columns, and I wrote it, received a kind of a negligible reaction at the time. And then 12 or 15 years later, it began to circulate in sort of more extreme newspapers in Pakistan as evidence of a Zionist plot to deprive Pakistan of its nuclear weapons. And so these things that in a previous era would have just died because no one would be able to find the newspapers have a kind of shelf life. And on a couple of occasions, more than a couple of occasions in my career, I've had unpleasant incidents with people associated with radical organizations.
Okay. So I love you so much. I can share my bullets with you if you want, because my backlash is bullets.
Yeah.
But why
I was made persona non grata in Lebanon, for instance.
Okay. So for criticizing, because you're very vocal of criticizing Islamism, here in the West, mostly in Iran, as I said, bullets, but in the West is censoring you, labeling you as Islamophobic. I want to just tell one of my story. I had a show at Voice of America, and I made a program to compare three religions, like Islam, Judaism, Christian, how they deal with extreme criticism. And it was very timely in Iran because the supreme leader, the dictator, renewed the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And I thought that I can educate people by showing them how Christian, Jews, and Muslim in the West, they deal with criticism, not like issuing fatwa or going after them to kill them. So here I actually made the program, which is everywhere, on Voice of America, YouTube, everywhere. I challenged the Christian. I went to the church in New York City, and I said, I had a big poster holding that, and I said, Jesus is not coming. You won't believe me. Beautifully talking to me, trying to convince me Jesus is going to come. And I was shocked how they actually handled this criticism. And the other side, Jesus is fake. You can see the face of people like being offended, but trying to communicate with you, debate, talk to you. Then I did another one, which we aired at Voice of America, denying Holocaust, to see how Jewish people deal with that. Amazing. The tolerance was beautiful. I actually challenged one of the survivors of Holocaust, and he came to me gentle and nice, talking about his own experience. The police didn't let me to say, Prophet Muhammad is not coming. Islam is fake. In New York City, I did my program, but I was not allowed to challenge Muslim, to challenge Islam.
When was that?
2000, I think 5 years ago.
So, there's been an interesting change in the West. So when I won a Pulitzer Prize 12 years ago, I guess, one of my columns for which I won the prize was called Mormons, Muslims, and Liberals, or something like that. And it happened, I wrote the column after the incident at Benghazi, when a fake movie, and by fake movie, I mean a movie that was never apparently even made, was used as a pretext for the protests that led to the attack on our consulate in Benghazi and the death of Ambassador Stephens there and others. And at the time when this happened, the Hillary Clinton, who's Secretary of State, denounced this horrible Islamophobic movie that actually nobody had seen. It was like nobody knew who did it. It was never completed.
Suddenly Hillary Clinton.
And suddenly Hillary Clinton, leading members of the State Department were saying, this Islamophobia is terrible. And then I compared it to the hit Broadway show, The Book of Mormon, which Hillary Clinton had actually gone to see. Now, The Book of Mormon is a giant send-up of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And I said, why is it funny to make fun of Mormons, but it's outrageous to make fun of Muslims? And the reason I mentioned this is that this was one of the columns I submitted for Pulitzer, and in fact, it helped me win the prize. And my criticism at the time was like, if you believe in free speech, You have to be able to criticize Muslims and Mormons and any other religion equally. You can't say that criticism of Islam is at a different level than criticism of Mormonism. It might be in bad taste, it might be hurtful, but we live in the West, and you should be able to criticize these things. That has really changed in the last 12 or so years. I think the attack on Charlie Hebdo, the French, satirical newspaper,
yes,
was a turning point where people learned the wrong lessons.
You think
from
so?
that. Yeah, I think the people responded to Charlie Hebdo by saying, well, that's outrageous. But then again, Charlie Hebdo was kind of asking for it. And I found that incredibly worrisome. I find it incredibly worrisome that there are these enormous places where we ought to be having vibrant and intelligent and good faith conversations that are now no-go zones. And what it means is that people are afraid to talk about it. They adopt kind of false narratives, or they speak in whispers. And that's just not healthy for a democratic society. We ought to be able to say, and a dozen years ago, many liberals did say it. Tony Blair used to say it, Labour leader of Great Britain. Too much of Islam today is represented by people whose values are not sympathetic with Western liberal values. And that's an issue. And if we can say that too much of right-wing Christianity in America has a problem with women or racial minorities or sexual or with gays and lesbians, then we ought to be able to say, that's also a problem in Islam. And we want an Islam in the West that sits in a good place with a broad sense of Western tolerance and a belief that if you're going to participate in this society in the United States or in Western Europe, you have to adopt certain bedrock values of Western democracy. Liberalism, tolerance, and opposition to anti-Semitism is another one. People don't want to talk about it. Instead, this word is, well, if you criticize Islam in any way, you're Islamophobic. I'll give you another example. I once made the point in a column that there is tragic underdevelopment in the Arab world. There is not a single university in the Arab world that is producing, great science, cutting edge science. The literary output in the Arab world is very low. Very few Western books or foreign books get translated into Arabic. Now, what was my source for these horrible allegations? It was something called the Arab Development Report that was put out by the United Nations, the UNDP Development Program, back around 2002 or so. And it came up, all written by Arab scholars, making an important point that the Arab world had, especially in educational and scientific fields, fallen critically behind. And it was a profound tragedy and problem from the Maghreb, all the way to the border of Iran. But when I wrote this, which seems to me like a perfectly legitimate issue, I don't know if I have the right answers to it, but a perfectly legitimate issue, the critique on social media was, well, this was just proof of my Islamophobia. Actually, no, it's proof that I'm concerned that a large part of the world is moving in a bad direction, not for the rest of the world, but for itself. Because if you're a young Arab man coming of age in Cairo or Damascus or Tripoli or Tunis, your chances of participating fully in the modern world are really diminished because there are no local universities where talented people can flourish. I don't see why that's Islamophobic, but there's now this relentless drumbeat that if you criticize any aspect of a culture that's not your own, it is impermissible. And that strikes me as an illiberal mentality that we need to address.
Is there any solution to, because for me, you mentioned it about the woman life freedom uprising. When I see Democrats everywhere, they're all about feminism. Yeah. They're all about women's rights. They're all about freedom. But at the same time, I see it with my own eyes being isolated like years ago, because I have launched a campaign against compulsory veiling in 2014. And then I've seen Women's March. I came from Iran. I got very excited. I joined the Women's March, chanting "My body, my choice," because it was beautiful. It was about my body, my choice. And then I asked the same women to join my campaign, "My body, my choice," and, remove their hijab, support the women of Iran who don't want to get beaten up by morality police. So join me and fight against compulsory veiling. They blocked me from everywhere. They ignored the women of Iran in the name of Islamophobia, or it's your culture. And you keep hearing that. It's their culture.
The problem is that the people who claim to be champions of liberalism have betrayed it. And it's a mystery as to how this happened. It's a mystery to me. I mean, maybe there's psychological answers, but how the West utterly turns a blind eye to the overwhelming evidence of repression in those parts of the world that they deem beyond limits from their criticism. I mean, by all means, you don't like Israeli policy in Gaza, let's say. Criticize it. But don't then remain silent when 1,600 people in Latakia, just a few 200 kilometers north of Israel, are massacred by Islamist militias, possibly working in collusion with the government. Don't tell me that, about your concern for Gaza, but have no idea of what the situation is right now in Khartoum, or so many other places from which the West looks away because they only want to look at the convenient areas on the map that conform with their ideology.
I mean, but you said about if you don't like Israel. When I myself criticized Netanyahu, immediately New Yorker, they welcome my criticism. But when I actually criticize the Islamic ideology that I have experienced living under Islamic ideology, they call me Islamophobic. They, like Ilhan Omar, she came after me and many of my women in our campaign saying that, that she actually introduced a legislation to identify those in academia, everywhere, media, identify those who causing Islamophobia. And I ask a simple question, whether criticizing Taliban is a form of Islamophobic ideas or criticizing Hamas and Islamic Republic. Who are you that you can find out people criticize Islamic ideology or Islamophobic? So for us, women in Iran, in Afghanistan, Iraq, everywhere, we want to find a solution to find out whether this is politics or they don't want to talk about some part of the world, feminism and like women's rights.
But in the 1960s and 70s, I think a lot of Soviet dissidents were flabbergasted to discover that so-called Western liberals were more sympathetic to the Brezhnev regime than they were to the refuseniks or to the other Soviet dissidents. It was difficult for them to understand that in the free world, many of the people who went around claiming to be the champions of freedom were objectively in greater sympathy to their oppressors than they were to the oppression from which they were suffering. And in fact, a whole literature developed around people like Jean-Francois Revel and others in the West to try to understand what he called the totalitarian temptation, which is why there was this temptation among Western progressives to succumb to totalitarian politics. And he had a line in one of his books where he said that it's easy to understand, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said it's easy to understand why some people would like to imagine themselves as the tyrant, to have the power. The much more difficult to understand is why some people secretly wish to be tyrannized, to be to have choices removed from them? Why were there so many people knowing exactly what Stalinism was all about in the 1940s and 50s, or then people also understanding what Soviet rule meant, who were marching under banners of Mao Zedong, right? Today, it seems astounding, but it's the same phenomenon of people who are now raising the banner of Hamas or Hezbollah as if this is a liberation movement.
I mean, in TikTok, you saw that Osama bin Laden suddenly became hero for the young generation here. Yeah. The 12-day war, which we mentioned, but was there any miscalculation from the Islamic Republic? We're talking about Trump. President Trump killed Qasem Soleimani. He's the president, walked out from nuclear deal. But it seems that the Islamic Republic didn't take his 6-day ultimatum seriously. Why? Why you think that?
Well, I've been more interested in your answer than mine, but for the most part, over 46 years, the experience of the Islamic Republic is that the West always caves, that they're never entirely serious. Even a killing of Soleimani, that was one general was quickly replaced, but that the attitude of the West is always to find a reason to negotiate with rather than confront the regime. And so they operated with immense arrogance. The other thing that I don't understand, never mind their attitudes towards the Trump administration or the United States, but I don't understand, after the pager strikes and the decimation of Hezbollah, after 2 successive rounds of ballistic missile attacks on Israel had essentially failed to do very much damage at all to Israel, after the fall of Bashar Assad's regime in Syria, that they were still so arrogant. And maybe it's the fact that Khamenei at 86 just was unable to process the reality that suddenly he was losing, that his plans were falling apart. Maybe it's that too many of the senior leaders in IRGC and other engines of the state apparatus were yes men who would just always tell the supreme leader what he wanted to hear. But the regime acted with an arrogance which was totally out of keeping with the experience of the previous 9 months. I can understand how up until, let's say, the summer of 2024, they could have behaved that arrogantly. But after that, you ask yourself, well, are they stupid? And maybe sometimes the answer is a simple yes, they were stupid. And it's a good thing because the world is safer for their stupidity. You
always, in your articles, were actually supporting escalatory reaction and robots. We knew that. All of us Iranians knew that the Islamic Republic understand only one language of pressure. But now, the war ended. The war between Israel and Islamic Republic ended. But people of Iran being left by a wounded regime that is taking revenge on its own people. I remember you compared nuclear deal to Munich agreement.
Yeah.
What is going to happen now? You think that this Islamic Republic that do not have Hamas, Hezbollah, Bashar Assad anymore, the high-ranking members of Revolutionary Guards, gone. Nuclear sites, gone. What's going to happen? They're going to go back to nuclear deal? The U.S. government going to have them negotiation table again?
I have no idea. I mean, look, I think that if the West had done nothing, if Israel had not struck, and if the United States had not added its voice, so to speak, or its muscle to that operation, then we would be moving inexorably towards the moment when Iran became a nuclear state. Now, I think that program has been set back not by 2 years, but by many years, because it's not simply a technical matter of them trying to reconstitute centrifuges. Now they know that if they try to do so,
what is going to be the
that at least this president will not be afraid to strike again, and this Israeli government will not be afraid to strike again. all of that means that anything they do will have to take place in much greater secrecy. They know that they've been deeply penetrated certainly by Israeli intelligence and probably by American intelligence too. So we've avoided one catastrophe for the world, which is that this regime gets the means to destroy other countries and further consolidate its power.
You don't think they're going to go back if they leave them here in this stage? They're going to rebuild the nuclear sites, rebuild Hezbollah if negotiation happen. If there's another deal that will empower the regime.
It all depends on what the deal is. And I have said that I would be in favor of the following deal, enforceable, which is that the regime verifiably, immediately, completely, and transparently abandons all nuclear efforts and ceases all support for foreign militias. The Houthis, the groups in Iraq, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on. And in exchange, the West offers to lift economic sanctions. Now, I don't think they would take that deal because it's central to the regime's identity, that it is a revolutionary regime that aims to destroy the little Satan and eventually the great Satan, and
to wipe out Israel from the map.
Exactly, to wipe Israel off the map. But what it will say to the people of Iran is, we preferred the path of centrifuges to the path of economic liberalization. We would rather spend another $500 billion, which is what, by some calculations, they spent on their nuclear program, for this ideological pursuit, than relieve the electricity crisis and the water crisis in Tehran, or reverse the continued collapse of Iranian currency and of their markets. And if they do that, I think a lot of Iranians who perhaps are on the sidelines would draw conclusions. I don't think you're going to see any movement, and again, you know better than I, but any Iranian movement in the next, say, 6 months, because the regime is going to be more repressive over the next 6 months. But what will happen is Khamenei will die. Maybe there will be a crisis of succession. Maybe there will be further economic shocks, particularly if the West doesn't remove energy sanctions. Maybe there will be further attacks by Israel. And all of that could create a scenario of massive social change against a regime that, unlike in 22 or unlike in 09, is much less confident, much more internally divided. I say that as maybes because we don't know. But those maybes are better than the certainty that Iran was going to one day acquire a nuclear weapon, consolidate its power in the region, and force everyone to sing its tune.
You know, there's a hypocrisy system in America when it comes to, as I said, bombing Gaddafi's regime. Democrat didn't say anything.
Well, it's a Democrat who bombed the regime.
Yeah, I mean, the media, they're all like supporting. So now when it's about bombing the nuclear site, about the regime they're trying to, their first target is destruction of America, destruction of global security. I see that a lot of people, like anti-war activists, analysts, politicians, trying to convince the world or convince President Trump to stay away from it. It's not actually just Democrats. They're MAGA people as well.
Well, look, I want to let me oddly maybe push back a little bit, because there is a legitimacy to the argument that as bad as the Tehran regime is, if the alternative is, say, full IRGC control, although it's essentially full IRGC control anyway, or a kind of Syria-like situation in Iran, Syria of the since 2011 through the civil war, that's no good for the West either. And the lesson of Libya is you got rid of this obnoxious dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, who by then was sort of semi-reformed. And the result was a crisis in Libya that led to a migration problem. So I get the argument. And I want to sort of give it its due. I understand that there is a good faith argument to be made that the that what could come after the Khameneist, the Islamic Republic, is civil war in Iran, migration crises, military rule that's even more repressive. You can imagine all kinds of scenarios. Mm-hmm. But you can also imagine much better scenarios. You can also say, yes, that could happen, but Iran is not Libya. It's not a desert kingdom. It's an ancient civilization with a tremendous amount of human talent, a population that has been living under and is increasingly united against Islamist repression. And what we could have is a pretty good outcome in Iran, an Iran that looked like the Iran before 1979. And so maybe that's worth a shot. I mean, we could have said the same thing about the Soviet Union. Don't let the Soviet Union collapse.
Because we're going to face chaos.
Because we're going to face chaos.
This is the narrative of Javad Zarif and the Islamic Republic lobbyists for years and years, warning the rest of the world that if Khamenei gone, if the Revolutionary Guard's gone, there is going to be another Syria. What happened to Syria now? So basically, this narrative was sold to the Western media and politicians that this is dangerous. The Islamic Republic itself is a danger, biggest threats to.
Well, to my mind, the Islamic Republic, the regime, is the greatest danger to the region, even greater than the messy collapse of Iran, even greater than and the reason that is that it was becoming a fully integrated member of the axis of oppression with Moscow, with Beijing, with North Korea, that it was its Middle Eastern outpost, and that posed a threat not just to the region but to the entire world. So if that collapses, it means that Russia will not have as big a role to play in the Middle East. The Chinese won't necessarily have a friend there. There will be an example to these regimes that, in fact, the West does have a spine, that we do enforce red lines, that when we say for 25 or 30 years Iran will not get a nuclear weapon, that we mean it. That could have a beneficial effect, say, in Taiwan, where the Chinese government has been saying, or rather in Beijing, where the Chinese government has been saying, oh, the West is a paper tiger. Maybe they'll now say, well, maybe he's not a paper tiger. And that's something to cheer, in addition to the fact that this awful regime has now been so substantially not just weakened, but humiliated. And I think that aspect of humiliation is important, because the power of the regime lies in part on the perception of its power. And I wonder if people in Iran, and I'm curious to know your view, people in Iran now look at these guys and say, oh, they're really tough. They're really powerful.
I mean, the humiliation of this regime was beautiful. I'm in touch with people every single day. They are worried. This is for fact. War comes with a lot of like civilians, when they got killed, I heard from Iranians that they were nervous. They were very scared. But at the same time, one of the women who has, sent me many time videos of women life freedom, walking unveiled, she said that if it's going to cost my life, but Iran is going to be free, I'm ready. I know that if I say this, a lot of people might say in the West, oh, you're welcoming war. No, it's the people inside Iran. They celebrated the death of IRGC commanders. There are a lot of now videos everywhere, people mocking Ali Khamenei, saying that Amerika هیچ غلطی نمیتوانست بکند, means they cannot do damn thing to us. America cannot do anything to us. They're mocking them, that where are you now? So the situation in Iran is now difficult. As you said, we cannot predict when people are going to take back to the streets, because the level of oppression is really high right now. But I am sure next wave will be much heavier, because people already paid huge price and they know what they want. But my main question is, if the West is ready to see an Iran without Islamic Republic.
Well, I think so. I mean, I certainly hope so. And should that happen, you're going to hear all kinds of people who were cheerleaders of the Republic talking about just how terrible it was and writing books. I'm looking forward. There's a group of people of Iranians here in the West who have essentially been fellow travelers with the regime for a long time. And I look forward to reading all of their books about, finally the darkness is lifted over their homeland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a familiar phenomenon. Right now they are, basically Javad Zarif's handmaids throughout the West. Look, the world would be
sorry to interrupt you. Those were Javad Zarif lobbyists in the West. Were the one actually advising President Obama not to get involved during 2009 uprising, because as you may remember, they absolutely kept silent, Obama's administration, when it comes to support the Green Movement. And then I challenged Hillary Clinton myself. So she said that was the advice that we got from Iranians in the West. So those were the people actually you mentioned about.
No, it was really poisonous because I think, and maybe you'll agree, that 2009 was a moment when the regime really could have fallen.
Because there were two internal crisis, internal division. And two of them were the fundamental, the leaders of this regime were actually calling people to come to the streets. But Obama in that time was trying to get a deal from Ali Khamenei.
And now if you talk to people who were in the administration at the time, they'll say, gosh, maybe we made a mistake.
Yeah, they did. Obama said that. But what cost the people of Iran paid? More than 100 people got killed that time when President Obama was sending a secret letter. So that's why I'm asking you the question again. Now it seems that the dictators like China, Venezuela, Russia, the Islamic Republic, they're really backing each other and supporting each other. But it doesn't look like President Trump being supported by, America's allies. Still, Canada just a few months ago designated the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization, but the rest of G7 didn't. So President Trump was the first one, but still, the G7 country, the democracies are not as united as authoritarian regimes.
Unfortunately, every now and then the French show a certain kind of realism about the threat that this regime. Macron was realistic about the nuclear threat. But you know better than I, and so
I met him in person.
Yeah, okay.
And I told him that why you don't call the Islamic Republic as who they are. The Revolutionary Guards must be designated as a terrorist organization. The U.S. did. The other G7 must do this to show the regime that you are backing the people in the Middle East who are being the victim of Revolutionary Guards. Or even, when women were getting killed, I actually had a delegation of women with me. One of the women's mother got killed. The other father was disappeared by the Iranian regime. The other one was a women's rights activist. Her father was assassinated in France. And I said, these are representing
I'm sorry,
Iran.
I'm now, clearly I had a senior moment because I realized 2015, François Hollande was the president of France. And he had a more realistic view.
No, President Macron was like, France is all about diplomacy.
Yeah.
He always want to be the good one in the room. So he wants to open the doors of diplomacy. So I don't think now democracies are having a plan, to be ready for post-Islamic Republic.
Look, it's very difficult to have a plan to be ready for something like that because it can go in 100 different ways.
So if what
I don't think they appreciate, what I don't think the Europeans appreciate is that given the threat that the Republic poses internationally, nothing would be worse than the survival of the regime. The collapse of the regime could be a great blessing for Iranians. It actually could be a mess. We don't know. But Iran is not just a domestic Iranian issue. Iran is a threat to the peace and security of the world.
To global
and
security.
Now it's a much weaker threat.
Yeah, we're talking about assassination plot against the President of the United States of America.
Yeah.
We're talking about dual national citizens from France to Germany, Netherlands, all over Europe. Dual national.
I was just in a debate with a person at a group called Responsible Statecraft. And she said, well, I understand that Iran is a threat to Israel, but Iran has never been a threat to the United States.
Wow.
And that was just such a flabbergasting comment. I mean, you here in Brooklyn, targeted with by an assassin, John Bolton, former national security advisor, the Cafe Milano, a popular eating destination in Washington, the diplomats in the American embassy in Beirut, the Marines in the Marine barracks in Beirut, the diplomats in the American embassy in Tehran, probably 1,000 U.S. soldiers killed by IEDs manufactured in Iran, thousands more grievously injured. And you're telling me that the Islamic Republic is not a threat to the United States? And if you can mount a nuclear warhead on a weapon, on a missile that has a range of, say, 1,200 miles, 1,500 miles, how much harder is it to create a missile with a range of 7,000 miles? To get to from a medium range to an intercontinental ballistic missile is not that difficult to do. So the naivete of so many Americans about the nature of this regime, despite all of the evidence that I just mentioned, is really flabbergasting.
Now we're talking here, the high-ranking clerics in Iran, very close tie to Ali Khamenei.
Yeah.
They issued fatwa against
Trump.
President Trump.
Yeah.
And when they actually threaten someone beyond their own borders, they really mean it.
Yeah.
According to a reliable source organization, Burman organization in Iran, more than 500 non-Iranians more than 500 people, Iranians or non-Iranians, were the target of either kidnapping plot or assassination plot beyond the Islamic Republic's border. So this is not a statistics. That shows that assassinating, killing is in the DNA of the Islamic Republic. That's why I want to repeat again my question. When I see that it's not just Democrat, I see that the mega people, the right-wing people, they're going to their extreme as well. When they say that the Islamic Republic is not a threat, I mean, everyone knows that the regime wants to have nuclear weapons, except I forgot his name.
Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson, yeah. So the MAGA people say that stay away from Islamic Republic because we are not at war with the Islamic Republic. How we can convince them, but the Islamic Republic is at war with America?
You know, it's interesting. The views of the extreme of the MAGA movement are increasingly indistinguishable from the views of the progressive left. And that's not entirely shocking. I mean, there's what's called the horseshoe theory of politics, which is, as you go towards the extremes, they actually start to come closer together. Certainly on foreign policy, I wrote a book about this more than 10 years ago, in which I talked about the ways in which the isolationist Republicans of the 1940s, people like Senator Robert Taft, sounded just like the progressive Democrats of the 1940s, people like Henry Wallace. They wanted America to have no part in fighting World War II, or certainly no part in enforcing the peace after World War II. They were opposed to NATO and its formation in the late 1940s. There's always been that kind of commonality between the two groups, in part because they have a vision of America and of American purity. For the left, American purity is essentially turning this country into a kind of their version of a progressive paradise that keeps its hands out of everything and focuses only on itself. And it's somewhat of a similar version with the right. You heard J.D. Vance, when he ran for Senate in Ohio, he said, I don't care what happens in Ukraine, I just care what happens at the Rio Grande, or words to that effect. And that's just a persistent delusion at the extremes of Western politics, that somehow if you leave the world alone, the world will leave you alone.
Exactly.
And it's just not true. I mean, maybe it's true if you're New Zealand or some distant country no one really thinks about. But unfortunately, when you're a global superpower, the world's not going to leave you alone.
No.
Islamist terrorists will come here and try
expand their ideology everywhere.
Bomb your cities. Russian spies will be here trying to make mischief. Chinese and so on. Bad actors will target you, and that's just a reality of international politics that the MAGA right and the progressive left don't want to look at.
Bret, I know that you are very vocal when it comes to criticize Islamism, Islamic Republic of Iran, but the conflict in Gaza left catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
More than 20,000 children got killed as well. How do you see this, and how you criticize the Israeli government in this, catastrophe?
I have a lot of criticisms of the government, but they're maybe not the ones that people think about. Look, let me state at the beginning. Hamas bears the blame for every death in this war.
Yeah, that's what I always read through your article as well.
Every single one. Not only because they started a war, people forget there was a ceasefire on October 6th, 2023. It's Hamas that broke it with the most barbaric attack in modern history. Far more barbaric, by the way, than the attack of 9/11. The attackers of 9/11 didn't butcher and rape Israeli women. The attackers of 9/11 didn't try to use garden hose to chop off the heads of Nepalese farmers. The attackers of 9/11 didn't take 250 people hostage into underground tunnels.
And proudly video their
and I'm not making any excuses for the attackers of 9/11, evil incarnate. But this was the worst atrocity in modern history. So they did that knowing that there was going to be a response. Then, when Israel responded, instead of putting Gazan civilians in that enormous network of tunnels that they had built over many years to protect the civilians, they were the ones who went underground and left Gazan civilians exposed. Notice that in Ukraine, when Russian drones or missiles attack, Ukrainian people go into the metros. They go underground, and the Ukrainian civil defense stays above ground and courageously tries to fight off the Russian attackers. So that's a point that I don't think we can lose sight of. Okay. And finally, if Hamas wanted to end this war, they could release the hostages and they could go into exile, and it would end the misery for the Gazan people. Now, having said all of that, could Israel have fought this war better? I think it could have. I think it made a major mistake by essentially deciding that the most important thing to do was to try to kill Hamas terrorists first, and then control territory second, and go after infrastructure third. It needed to do the very difficult work of going after the infrastructure first, all of the tunnels through which Hamas has been able to protect itself. Now, there were reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is it was hard to go after the tunnels. And after just losing 1,200 people in this massacre, they didn't want to lose more people in tunnels. But in hindsight, could the war have been fought better? Absolutely. But I'll just say this. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, which we consider the moral pinnacle, the high point of Western military righteousness, our boys going on shore to defeat the Nazi evil in Europe. Our bombers killed an estimated 25,000 civilians in an effort to weaken German defenses in Normandy. That is a tragedy. And that was in a day or two that we did that. But we don't talk about that because we understand that the larger purpose was to defeat this atrocious regime. So by all means, let's judge Israel, but let's at least judge it in light of circumstances in which we have found ourselves. And I think Israel is within its rights to want to destroy a group that perpetrated the kind of evil that was perpetrated.
It was a blessing for people. Let's just say it. I'm not shy to say that. It was a blessing for the entire Middle East to see the elimination of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Revolutionary Guards. But a lot of time, I see the emotion goes really high when people talk about the conflict here in the West, you either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. Is there a third narrative?
Well, there should be, because to me, the only way in which you can be pro-Palestinian, genuinely pro-Palestinian, is to be anti-Hamas. Just as the only way you can be pro-Iranian is to be anti-Islamic regime. I'm pro-Lebanese. Lebanon is a beautiful country. I miss visiting Lebanon. Right?
Me too. I
a
love
lovely
Lebanon.
place that has been tyrannized by a terrorist militia for more than 40 years, right? And if you go before that to the days of the PLO, 50 years. Why not say that Lebanon deserves to govern itself and the Palestinians ought to be able to get out from under the thumb of Hamas so they can have genuine self-government, not by theocratic thugs and ideologues, and that the Iranian people should be able to govern themselves not through the rule of the jurist, but through normal democratic elections freely contested. And I don't see anyone on the political left today making what seems to me a common sense point. If you want one day to have a Palestinian state that lives next to a Jewish state and a Jordanian state and an Egyptian state, the only way that's ever going to happen is if you destroy Hamas. I'm sorry to say that, but it's the only way it's going to...
And the roots, the Islamic Republic, the greatest sponsor of Hamas.
And also, by the way, and I would add this, people say, well, you can't get rid of Hamas because Hamas is an idea as much as it is a movement. Look, National Socialism is also an idea. And after World War II, I'm sure there were many Germans who still in their hearts were National Socialists. But those Germans also understood that National Socialism was a path to national catastrophe. And so Germany became the country it is, not only because they were defeated, but because Germans understood that this ideology would never serve them well. And I hope that the lesson out of this war, out of this terrible war, with so much unnecessary and tragic death to a critical majority of Palestinians, is we never want to go down the path of Hamas again, because that path can only lead to devastation for us. What's the path? Let's look at the United Arab Emirates. Let's look at Costa Rica. Let's look at small countries that managed to do great things because they preferred peaceful progress over the ideology of endless and ultimately self-defeating resistance.
You said that you're the minority in New York Times. I feel now people like me who wants to have the same freedom as women in America, we are minority here in America with the same slogan. We want to be free. We want to have a normal life. We want to have, as I said, normal life. We feel minority here in America, as I mentioned, because MAGA people say this is your problem, go and deal with it. And the left say that they more sympathize with our oppressors. How we can change this and to get more, people talk about this, because now when the war in their mind ended, nobody will want to talk about the danger, the Islamic Republic, the roots of all these, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi. No one talks about it.
I think there's a tragic reality, Masih, which is that even in free societies, the number of people who truly care about freedom is small. Freedom is a nice word and a very heavy responsibility. And, just take, for instance, the woke movement, if you want to call it that, in the last 10 years or so. In a free society, all of a sudden, free people became terrified about expressing more or less ordinary opinions simply because they didn't want bad feedback on social media, or they didn't want to be criticized by a colleague. We talk about freedom a lot, but the number of people who have the inner reserves of courage, a certain indifference to being unpopular, a feeling that a set of principles matters more to them than their immediate gratification, there are not many people like that. There just aren't. There's a Natan Sharansky, there's a Masih Alinejad. You kind of think, I can think sort of in my head, I go down the list, a handful of people in Cuba and elsewhere who are Jimmy Lai in my old friend in Hong Kong.
Suffering in prison now.
Suffering in prison in Hong Kong. But these people are rare people.
But it's beyond sad when you see your children might be the next victim of this chaos in the West. It's so sad that now our oppressors became the hero of your children, our children here in America, and that's why I feel lonely. When I say New York Times calling our oppressors dictators, calling them heroes, I'm worried about the future leaders of America because they're targeting the youth here. When I say I feel lonely, because I want to protect democracy, because I love America and I want to protect America from these dictators.
But you have to remember America is more than Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. And there is a kind of inner common sense to a lot of Americans, even if they don't always express themselves, perfectly. I think I look at my son's generation. My son is 20. And I see a powerful sense of freedom that has been strengthened and tempered by the kind of everyday oppressiveness of the speech police and the kind of politically correct people that he has to deal with. I see a young man who's thinking for himself, sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right, but he has his own thoughts, and who has the capacity to laugh at some of the censorious bullshit that he has to deal with on his college campus. So I'm not ready to give up on the country. The strength and weakness of dictatorships is that a dictatorship is always very good at presenting its strength. During the Soviet period, you would see the May Day parades with, or the Victory VE parades with mass armaments going through Red Square. And people thought the Soviet Union was strong. And even the Soviets thought they were strong. But they were much weaker because all they did was show you their strength and disguise their weakness. They disguised it so well they didn't know how weak they were until they crumbled. Democracy is just the opposite. We talk only about our weaknesses. We think only about our weaknesses. We think about everything that's problematic in our society. There's never been a front page of the New York Times that says things in general are gradually getting better. But actually, most days, things in general really are gradually getting better. And because we obsess about our weaknesses, we sometimes don't even know how much strength there is in the country. So we don't, or we're not paying attention to the areas of future strength. In the 1970s, which was another bleak period in American history, people didn't know that there was this guy, Steve Jobs, who was kind of like fooling around with these things called computers. I love it when
you're really optimistic. But the thing is now, because you said that we see the negative thing, we see our weak. Millions of girls are being kicked out from school in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And those liberal who launch campaign bring our girls back.
They don't care.
Nigerian girl. They don't care.
Yeah, they don't care.
They don't care. So the university campus is full of students.
Well, now you're basically explaining or describing why I'm not a liberal.
But I don't want you to be minority. I don't want people like me to feel lonely in America, where America is the dream of millions of people in the world, that they want to have freedom of expression here. I'm going to say something to you, which is funny, but at the same time, I was walking in the street. One of the elderly guy stopped me and said that I love you, I fight with you, I cry with you, I laugh with you, I love your energy when I see you on TV, but please don't go to Fox News. They're using you. They're not your friends. No. 1 block later, another guy stopped me, said the same thing, but don't go on CNN. CNN, they are miserable. They're not your friends. And I told him that having CNN and Fox News is the dream of millions of people in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Russia, in China, North Korea. If you really want to shut down one of the media that you don't like and have one state-controlled TV, go to North Korea, go to Russia, go to Iran. This is the democracy and freedom of speech that we have to protect. And I see now everyone praising, like President Trump praising Putin. I see that Democrats, they are praising terrorist regime in Iran. So I feel like isolated.
I understand exactly what you're saying. I would say that in the 1970s, many people who cared about the future of freedom felt that way. And this country often finds a way of surprising itself for the better at moments when we least expect it. Pessimism is the natural posture of democracy. But pessimism can be actually positive, paradoxically, if you don't become a fatalist. It's not a bad thing to focus on what's wrong. And it's not a bad thing to worry about the future or the future of freedom. If you're worrying about it intelligently and constructively, you're going to do something about it. And I think one of the things that, at least historically, has made America different is we're not a nation of fatalists. We don't say, you know, inshallah, if God wills it, who knows what will happen. We take matters into our hands and we do something about them. You're doing something about them. You are making a life of exemplary freedom seeking and creation. And thank God it took a journalist from Iran to come to this country and show Americans who'd had the benefits of freedom all our lives, like why this is precious and how to use your freedom best.
Let's leave it here. I love what you said. You said you're not going to give up your country, your fight. That's it. We love freedom. We love freedom of speech, and we're going to fight together and protect it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.